Are you struggling to capture the rich, luminous colors that you want to achieve in your oil paintings? Or do you have a favorite painter like John Singer Sargent or Cecilia Beau, whose work just has fabulous color and light that you would love to capture in your own work? Well, then watch this video, because this exercise is the most effective, foolproof tool that I have found for showing you exactly how to get the color you want in your artwork. By the end of this video, you will have a straightforward method to begin translating the colors that you love into your own paintings. And if you love this exercise and you want to go even deeper to paint more expressive, painterly oil paintings, and you want my personalized help, there's a link in the description to book a free consult directly with me to lay out a plan to help you reach your art goals. After all, this is exactly what I do. If you're new here, my name is Chelsea, and I really love creating painterly, expressive oil paintings, especially portraiture. And what I also specialize in is helping artists just like you to be able to take your artwork to that level, to really master the kind of looseness that you're after. So let's go ahead and get to that exercise so you can do this for yourself. All right, so you all have spoken and the consensus was very clear. While a lot of you were very emphatic that I should paint both the Cecilia Beau and the Anders Zorn as master copies, the preference was definitely for the Cecilia Beau piece. So this is what I'm going to be working off of today. And to aid in this, I'm going to be using these paint chips from the hardware store that I picked up for free. So really quickly, I want to go ahead and walk you through how I selected these, because you might notice there is a good amount of overlap between the colors in each of these. Granted, this is a little bit skewed toward the purples because the purple is taking up a whole bunch of real estate here in my hand right now, but notice that I have a lot of the cream colors, the greens, and the browns that appear throughout this image. The way that I actually selected these paint chips that we're going to be working from was that I literally went and I got my print, I took it into the hardware store, and I actually held up paint chips to the print looking for how they matched up. So for instance, let's take for example this little purple swatch. Now bear in mind, this is tricky because this is a very matte paint chip, and then this is clearly a very glossy print off. But when I put these up to one another, and I'm just looking for this little tiny area just to the right of the tie, there is a good deal of similarity in some of these colors. Similarly, if I go a little bit darker, I can see a little bit more. Now, the idea of this isn't to get it perfect, especially in the dark areas of the painting. This can actually be next to impossible, just because the way that these paint chips are printed, again, they are going to be like kind of a matte sheen, and they're really going to struggle to get as dark as some of the images on the painting itself. But actually holding these up, I could do quite a few tests to see that, like, oh, okay, this paint chip actually matches really nicely with the color of the suit, for instance. Or this paint chip really matches something like the orange of the cat or some of the background colors for this setting. So this is actually a really great introduction to this exercise in general, because this starts to get your mind really actively interrogating the color that you see in your favorite paintings and trying to match it. We're just going to be taking that one step further today with the paint itself. So, diving right in, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take this reference image away because I can much more easily just share this on screen without all of this distracting glare. This will also give me a little bit more of a workspace. And then I'm gonna just take my paint chips and say goodbye to this really beautifully fanned out collection, because I'm gonna be pulling paint chips from this at random and all of it's gonna get messed up. So to begin, I can go a couple different ways. One way that's pretty straightforward is to start with a color that you think would be pretty straightforward to match. Another way would be to go with a color that appears a lot throughout the painting. So this particular paint chip, for me, represents the bulk of the color that I see over and over in this painting, whereas this paint chip represents one that I think would be pretty straightforward to match. Now, some examples of paint chips that are going to be kind of tricky to match would be these. The reason is that they are all very neutral, and our brains typically feel like we can identify a really bright color versus a very neutral color. The other advantage is things that are closer to true primaries, you can't mix. So they're going to be very close to the paint that you have out of the tube, whereas the neutrals, you do inevitably have to mix some. So there's just more work involved in actually putting these together. So I'm going to hold off on this little collection for the time being. And let's go ahead and dive in with each of these. And all I need for this, I need my paints laid out. I have here my standard studio palette. This is a little bit messy, but that's because you're actually taking a look at my studio in use versus me, creating a set for a YouTube video. So most of these colors are Vasari. I still have some leftover colors that just happened to be on my palette before, but I have here titanium white, yellow ochre. I believe this is, I think this is the Vasari yellow ochre, but sometimes I will go for yellow ochre pale, depending on the circumstance. This is Terra Rosa, transparent oxide red, transparent oxide brown, permanent rose. I believe this has a different name in Vasari. I think it's like ruby red, ultramarine blue, and this might be ultramarine blue deep, technically, Viridian. And then I have a few kind of leftover cadmiums. This is Cad Lemon, and this is, I believe, Cad Yellow Pale Deep. It's very similar to Cad Orange. Actually, looking at this, I suspect this pile was the Cad Yellow Deep, and this is probably one of the Cad Oranges that I have. If I realize that I need some cadmiums, I will replenish this pile. So diving right in, I'm going to go ahead and start with what I think might be the trickier of the two colors. I'm going to begin just with this really dominant color that I see throughout the composition. So I'm starting with the color that just subjectively looks closest to this, which would be my yellow ochre. And I know that this is a little bit dark. It's also a little bit too orange, whereas this is a little bit more green. Titanium white tends to behave as a blue. So my hope is that in adding a little bit of titanium white, that this cools off the mixture just a little bit and lightens it up. Chances are this is going to lighten it too much. Now, if I were actually painting this versus just doing this exercise, I would probably mix in much bigger piles, or at least I hope that these piles would be much bigger. But because I'm just doing this little test, I'm trying not to use too much of my paint. So I just dipped into Viridian there because I could tell this had to go closer to green. And now I can see that I'm pretty close. This is a touch dark. I'm going to take just a little bit of my lighter mixture here. This is a little bit on the warm side, so I might have to go back in with some green. This may lighten it too much. Now I am definitely too far in the green territory. You can see, because if I put this over, suddenly the swatch looks really yellow. So it tells me I need to reintroduce some yellow. Probably bring in a little bit more titanium white, because my suspicion is that this is getting a bit dark. And since these are so close together, I'm essentially just looking at them side by side. But if I wasn't sure, I could absolutely just take a little bit on my knife and put it over and make that subjective judgment call from there. So I'm going to just be a little bit optimistic and say like, okay, I think I'm kind of close. And I'll go ahead and just put the mark down on the swatch, and immediately I can see that this value is just a little bit dark. That being said, overall, the color seems to be performing pretty well, like the color is close. I actually just want to see what happens if I take just a touch of my Cad Lemon and bring it in here. Now, this is a really strong color. It's going to be overpowering. It definitely pulls this toward a little bit more of a like chartreuse versus something like closer to the olive green family. All right, so this is a little bit closer, but it's still just a little bit dark. So I'll go ahead and add some titanium white. Now, this is kind of the perennial problem. The more you mix your colors, the more you will get an intuitive feel for just how much you need. But a lot of color mixing is literally just mixing things up, overcorrecting, and then having to go back and fix it. And so being okay with being wrong the first time is really helpful. This is one of those like mindset shifts that I think really separates the pros from the amateurs or the hobbyists. All right, that's really close. In terms of value, it disappears. It's just a touch like less chromatic or less saturated color-wise. So I'm adding just a hint more Cad Lemon. I think honestly, Cad Yellow Light would probably be a better option for this, but I'm honestly using this just because it's convenient. This color is dull enough that I should be able to get there just with the yellow ochre alone. And that is one of those secrets. Like a bright color usually will require some brightness on your palette, but dull colors, typically you can get away with a much more neutral palette. And there, I think we are functionally close enough because that very last mixture really disappeared. So here you can see a close-up of all of those mixtures, beginning with the initial one that was too dark, and then going all the way until the one that actually disappears on the card. What's great about this is that if I can match it on the card, I have the skills to mix and match this color anytime I need this color. So for instance, knowing that this is a really dominant color in this Cecilia Beau painting that I'm going to study, what's fantastic is that I know that I can now mix up this color. My palette can do it. I even can probably just remember this mixture as a little bit of a shorthand to get me started when I'm actually doing the color study itself. But what's so great about this exercise in comparison to doing a full color study is that it really simplifies this down to the core of what makes your mixing and matching skills work. It eliminates all the other variables and it keeps it really simple, and it gives you very clear and immediate feedback. So I could look at this initial mixture, for instance, and realize, oh, this is too dark. Or I could look at the next one and say, okay, it's very slightly too light and it's a little bit too gray, until I finally could arrive at this final mixture that actually disappears onto the card. And the way that I know that this is good to go is that it literally does disappear. This paint is every bit as thick as all of the other little daubs of paint that I put on here, but because it just looks invisible, I know that I've gotten it. Getting this immediate feedback in painting is so incredibly undervalued. Think about painting compared to basketball. You know whether you've made the shot or not. So you can tell if everything that led up to you making that shot was successful and set you up for success. But in painting, we often really lack that clear and immediate feedback. This actually helps us to engineer some of this into the process with oil painting. When we do something like this and we can very quickly tell, because the mark doesn't disappear, that something is wrong, from there we can ask just 3 very simple questions. 1, is the mark obvious? Is it not blending in because it was too dark or too light? If it's one of those, then we need to solve that problem first. And that's exactly what happened here. I started with my mixture too dark, and I went ahead and I corrected the value. I overshot just a little bit. And then the next question became, is this the right hue? And the answer is that it was just a little bit off in terms of that hue. It was just a little bit too close to green. It was pulling more in the green direction. And finally, if the hue and the value are correct, we can see if the saturation is an issue. These are the only three things that contribute to colors being inaccurate. Either the value is off, the hue is off, or the saturation / chroma is off. And this makes this exercise really, really simple. And because it is so simple and because it's so clear if you've gotten the mixture right or not, and it's so simple to be able to actually correct yourself when you didn't get it right, you start getting in really effective repetitions very quickly. So let's go ahead and go over to the next card that I have here. Let's go over to this gray. Starting off, the color that is closest to this on my palette is going to be my titanium white. So I'm going to start with that as my base. And then I would say this is a little bit more of a blue-gray, and I only have one blue on my palette, which is the ultramarine. So I'm going to take just a hint of ultramarine, and I'm going to start mixing it into my titanium white. Now, you might actually have a black on your palette. You might have ivory black that you're working with. If that's the case, I would say that probably would have been the most rational second color to go ahead and grab. But for me, I typically will make black by combining my ultramarine with my transparent oxide brown. So to get this more toward gray, since I already have the ultramarine in this mixture, I'm just going to grab a little bit of the transparent oxide brown. You can see that just a little bit of this goes a really long way. But I've arrived at something that is pretty darn gray. So let's go ahead and just give this a little test on my card. And right away, I can tell that this is a little bit light. So this is tricky because the ultramarine and the transparent oxide brown are both pretty strong in their tinting strength. So I need to grab just like a teeny tiny bit and hope it doesn't darken this mixture too much. I almost would have preferred it if this were too dark and I can just add a little bit more titanium white into it, just because that titanium white doesn't overpower quite as much. All right, so I have my second mixture here, and this is a little tricky just because there is some sheen from my light source, but already I can tell this is much closer. I would say it's still a hair light. So I'm just starting with my ultramarine. And let's go ahead and do one more little pass. And again, we're getting really, really close here. I would say maybe just a hair each of some transparent oxide brown and maybe just a touch more titanium white. And depending on your use case, it might not even be necessary to get this exacting. I just want to show you just how far we're able to take this, just how precise we're able to get. All right, and to me, this looks actually like a little bit purple compared to this mixture. It probably means that I just have a little bit too much ultramarine, but I'm gonna see what happens if I add just a little bit of Viridian to this, but I really like the value. And I'd say right about there, at least in person, this is at the point where it looks like it disappears. Again, it's a little bit tricky with just the amount of sheen that we get with the lights and the angle of the camera. But what's really cool about this is that, again, this shows me that if I can mix up these two colors, I am functionally good to go in terms of being able to actually apply this to something like a master copy or my own work. And so if you know what kind of color you want to put into your original paintings, going to the hardware store and picking up paint swatches like this and practicing this can really quickly help to build up muscle memory and kind of a mental library of how your colors work. And then similarly, if you are doing something like this Cecilia Beau master copy and you actually choose your color swatches or your paint chips based on that particular painting, it really shortcuts the process of being able to work that way, being able to actually mix up the color you need for that particular painting. So I could absolutely go through and show you what this looks like for every one of these paint chips. Putting all of this together, one thing that I want to say is that for the more neutral colors, I know that I should be able to mix these up no problem. As we get more and more chromatic, I might have to bring out some specialty colors that aren't always on my studio palette, like my cadmiums. The trickiest ones are going to be things like purples. In general, really vibrant purples can be very tricky to capture in oil paint. The good news is that if it's been done in oil paint before, like this Cecilia Beau portrait, I should be able to replicate it. But this is going through a few layers of distortion. First, the artwork has aged quite a bit. There might be a patina on the varnish. Then it was photographed. Then it was digitized and put online. And then it was printed off. And those colors can absolutely shift through all of those levels of processing that the image has gone through. So this little accent here might not truly represent exactly what was on the painting itself, but when I take a color like this one that is more vibrant, what I will do is I will start with the most chromatic colors that are close to this one. In my case, this is going to be something like my ultramarine, my permanent rose, and then some titanium white, just to bring in the slightly pastel element that this requires. If I find that I get stuck on something like this, that might be time for me to actually pull out some purples that are just sitting in my cabinets that I don't put on my palette very often, and see if those actually perform better. So why don't we do a quick test of that? All right, so once again here, I have my paint chip laid out. You can see my palette layout up here. I'm gonna go ahead and begin with just a little bit of ultramarine and then permanent rose, and then a touch of titanium white. This will also really help me with these very dark transparent colors like the ultramarine. They tend to appear very dark at first, and it can be very difficult to tell what color you've actually mixed. So already I can tell this is dark, so I'm gonna grab just a little bit more titanium white. I'm gonna do this incrementally in stages until I think I'm at least reasonably close to my paint swatch. So I'm still on the dark side here. And just offhand, when I put these side by side, this to me looks like it is a little bit more red than my paint chip. So I'm gonna grab just a little bit of that ultramarine and keep going just little bit by little bit until I think I'm in the ballpark. And I can actually just put these really close to one another to see just how close I'm getting. And let's go ahead and just do a test. So right off the bat, again, the sheen is a little bit tricky, but this looks to be just maybe a touch too red, and it might be a little bit light. I need to actually look at this from a couple of different angles to check that. I'm definitely getting some sheen from my lights here. Interesting. So as soon as I take my light away, my perception of it changes. Getting closer, this now to me looks just maybe a hair dark. Now we get into kind of interesting territory. Depending on the position, sometimes this looks a little bit light in value, but the main issue that I see right now is this actually looks a little bit bright. It looks a little bit too high chroma. So if I reposition this, you should be able to see that just a little bit better. I have a couple of options of how I can actually reduce the chroma here. So one is that I could introduce a little bit of yellow, or I could split the difference and I could add something like brown. Because this is maybe just a touch on the light side, I'm gonna go for a darker value color, and I'm gonna pick up just a little bit of the transparent oxide brown. Now this will warm things up, so I might have to compensate with a little bit more of the ultramarine. That little tiny speck of color on the top of my knife is kind of distracting. Yep, and that's definitely just a little bit. Now on the warm side. So going back in with just a little bit of ultramarine. And this is a bit subjective, but this just seems to me like it's just not light enough. That being said, I can tell that I'm not going to have to reach for a specialty purple at this stage because I'm so close. If I were wildly off, no matter what I did, then I would really have some concerns. I'm going to try and just take the impasto off of this. Okay, so now we are too light. So clearly there's just a little bit of like a perceptual issue that this presents, where the difference in sheen and the difference in like the contrast of the paint sitting on this gray surface is making me misjudge this value very slightly. So an interesting data point for sure. Again, trying to show this to you all to where the sheen on all of this is even. It's really hard to do on camera. Interestingly, I think about here was where I was closest. So I'm gonna backtrack slightly, get a little bit more permanent rose, a little bit more of my ultramarine. Again, I think the chroma on that's just gonna be a little bit too high, so I'm gonna try and like gray this down a little bit with some transparent oxide brown. And I'm actually gonna take just a little bit of the gray that I mixed up before. I'd say depending on the sheen, on camera, I would say that looks a little bit light in value, but in person, that one is probably the closest. So what's great about this is this was definitely my highest chroma color in the entire bunch. It was the only one where I was really concerned about my ability to actually make this mixture happen. And what that tells me is that when I actually go and I paint this master copy, I'm not going to have to worry whether I need to break out any specialty colors. This will also really just help me to set my palette, lay out the right colors from the get-go, and just dive in. All right, thank you so much for sticking with me through this whole video. I hope this exercise has been genuinely helpful, and I can't wait to hear all about your color mixing breakthroughs. Again, if you would like my help on this journey, I would love to hear from you. And until next time, happy painting.